Hello and welcome to another lecture in Political Science 1, Introduction to Government and Politics in the United States. Today's lecture is Federalism and the Constitution, Part 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Hello and welcome to another lecture in Political Science 1, Introduction to Government and Politics in the United States. Today's lecture is Federalism and the Constitution, Part 2. Today we're going to be looking at the different constitutions that were established in the Articles of Confederation and what we know today as the Constitution of the United States. We'll also look at the debates that really emerge out of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and how the debate around representation and the compromise that ultimately produces our legislative branch of government and the core values within our representative system of government created a kind of precursor to the debates of federalism that have set up some of the most historically important debates throughout American politics and really define how we debate the contemporary issues of today's world. Federalism and the Constitution, Part 2. What oftentimes gets overlooked in American history classes is the reality that this country's founding after the Declaration of Independence was a complicated story. It wasn't as if after the Declaration of Independence, all of a sudden we were marching in a positive direction toward equality and a perfect democracy. The truth is that the first effort to codify in law, to create a constitution that prescribes what government can and cannot do, was in large part a disaster. From 1777 to 1788, it was the Articles of Confederation that did a poor job at best in defining what the government could and could not do, how the states in the country were to relate and trade and interact with one another, what could be done, or rather what wasn't done to define how we would pay for governmental activities and what we would do to defend our interests as a country. The biggest failure of the Articles of Confederation that will overarch as a theme of the four specific failures that were highlighted at the Constitutional Convention to really point to why this document was a disaster was that the Articles of Confederation was founded upon a system of government called Confederacy. From 1777 to 1788, the United States was a confederation of states. That is dramatically different than the system of government that gets adopted at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and formally ratified into law in 1788 with the Federal Constitution of the United States. It is the Federal Constitution of the United States that is our law today. The Federal Constitution is a complicated and much debated work that was created in an effort to try to mitigate and deal with the issues and problems created under the Articles of Confederation during the first decade of this country's founding. So before we can talk about the federal constitution of today's United States, it's important for us to ground our understanding in the first effort to create a constitution in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was in place and was the national framework of law that was supposed to prescribe what government could and could not do, the specific powers of the government relative to what it would be able to do in international affairs and how it would govern domestic policy. For the first decade of this country's founding, immediately after the Declaration of Independence was signed, it was recognized that if we were going to be an independent nation, we would have to have a framework of law that established how our government was to govern and how it would gain its powers legitimately. And so the Articles of Confederation are a reflection of a principle that was adopted and universally accepted called the principle of confederation. A confederation is very simply a loose association of states with limited or in some cases no central government to coordinate national interests. To put it candidly, the emphasis in a confederation is on state power. In confederacies, it is the states that govern most of affairs, and it is very little, they have very little to do with one another. Almost independent sovereign nations within a confederation, which is really a loose association of these powers that exist at the state level. Under the Articles of Confederation in this country's history, the centralized government that was around was virtually powerless. This capacity of having a powerless centralized government created a lot of problems for the first decade of this country's founding, the decade which was supposed to be governed under the Articles of Confederation. There are four specific failures that were pointed to at the Constitutional Convention as the main harms and impacts that were causing crisis throughout the early periods of American history after the Declaration of Independence and during the latter years of the Revolutionary War and ultimately into the first years of our nation post-Revolutionary War. The first failure is an important one relative to the ability of the United States as a government to interact with other nations. There was no national means to finance governmental activities on a national level. This is important because what it means is that the federal treasury that we know of today and the IRS, as you know, that we interact with every year and every week when we see taxes deducted from our paychecks, did not exist. There was no taxation of the sort that we understand today on a federal level to finance a national governmental set of activities, of which would have included sending diplomats to foreign countries to interact and establish trade agreements. This is not to suggest that we weren't sending diplomats and ambassadors to other countries to engage in international relations, whether it be political or economic. But the ambassadors and diplomats that were sent to countries like France and Spain, Portugal, and ultimately even England were financed out of state revenue. States like Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania and Boston and Massachusetts, in Massachusetts, were able to finance the sending of their own ambassadors and diplomats out of state revenue. There was not a national revenue that was used to send ambassadors and diplomats for trade negotiations or international relations affairs whatsoever. This is a huge problem for establishing a sense of national identity and ability of the United States as one country to represent itself in a united fashion in international affairs. Another failure of the Articles of Confederation is it provided no framework for a standing national army or navy. During the Revolutionary War, one of the most important things that George Washington brought to that conflict was an ability to unite independent militias. The war was fought on the backs of state militias, which had allegiances to their own states and necessarily did not have an allegiance to one nation. Washington is important because of his ability to unify these different militias and create a grand strategic plan to ultimately overthrow and defeat the British military. But when the Revolutionary War ended, this unified militia dissolved, and each militia retracted to their individual states and remained loyal almost exclusively to the state interests for which they resided. There was no standing navy either. The port cities had large ships and the ability to purchase cannons and other types of weaponry that could be used on ships. And in some cases, during the Revolutionary War, we had actually purchased warships from France and Portugal and Spain and other nations that were sympathizers of the revolutionary cause and the American independence. But again, like the Army, these ships of war were loyal and owned by states like Massachusetts and Virginia and the Carolinas. They did not have an allegiance to defend the sovereignty of the United States per se as one nation, as they were owned by individual financiers from different states. Because of this inability to have a framework that would establish an army and navy on a national level, there was the third failure: no means to defend American interests in foreign affairs. There are two levels to this interests, and one is diplomatic, and the other, of course, is by force. The United States, as it emerged out of the Revolutionary War under the Art of Confederation, obviously had an interest in preserving classical state sovereignty, meaning the ability of the government to protect its people and its territory. There was no means to defend American interests in foreign affairs relative to military interactions out of the Revolutionary War, and then furthermore in terms of diplomatic relations to ultimately lead to potentially treaties and other arrangements. This is very important in the early part of American history because it's this third failure that many people point to as being the catalyst behind what would later be a re-engagement of conflict with the Britons from the north moving in from Canada, what is today Canada, in the War of 1812. Ultimately, this third failure, no means to defend American interests in foreign affairs, would be dealt with when the Constitutional Convention convened in 1787 and ultimately ratified itself in 1788. But the layover of this third failure defined the last few years of the 18th century and into the first few years of the 19th century, and set up a context that many historians agree led to the War of 1812 and the effort by the British military and British Crown to reinvade and reclaim the Americas as a colonial interest rather than an independent nation. The fourth failure is also important: no means to prevent interstate conflict. There's another level to this, which is that not only was the Articles of Confederation not able to prevent one state from, say, invading and having a militia-to-militia battle with another state, but if a state were to have an issue within its own borders, then there was no national guard or national army to send in to quell the violence, to end or put down the internal intra-state issue. This is a major problem, personified best historically by Daniel Shea and his rebellion in Massachusetts. Shea's rebellion is generally pointed to as the straw that breaks the camel's back relative to the Articles of Confederation. Shea's rebellion is a perfect example of the Articles of Confederation and its inability as law to protect the interests of the states independently and the nation as a whole. In Massachusetts, many of the financiers of the Revolutionary War began to ask for their repay of debt at the end of the war. You see, during the Revolutionary War, the Americans had paid for the war, had paid for ships and weaponry, bullets and uniforms, out of the pocketbooks of some of the wealthier elites from the New England area and other parts of the country. And in Massachusetts in particular, at the end of the war, the financiers had requested to be repaid if they were to have won. Well, with the war over and victory seized, the financiers of the American Revolution demanded payback with interest, and they turned to the state governments to collect money necessary to pay back the debts to these financiers of the war. In Massachusetts, the government there decided to begin raising state property taxes on its residents to begin collecting enough revenue for the state to pay back its own financiers within Massachusetts. As taxes on property began to rise, people began to have difficulty paying their taxes to the state government. Ultimately, people were unable to pay their taxes, and the state government in Massachusetts, through the state courts, would issue proclamations to claim the land and then sell the land in open auction, creating money which would then be used and redistributed to pay off the financiers of the Revolutionary War. This practice of issuing proclamations to claim the deeds and lands of people in Massachusetts who could not pay their taxes, became so universal and so popular in that state that they ultimately needed to call in the militia to forcibly remove people from land. If people were unwilling to give up their deeds to their property, the militia was called in by the state government in Massachusetts to remove people from the land and force them to comply to the law and the demands of the government for higher taxes on property. Well, with this practice becoming more and more popular at the state level in Massachusetts, inevitably, the government began to tax members of the militia itself. Daniel Shea, being the head of the state militia in Massachusetts, organized a revolt against the Massachusetts government and the courts when they began to collect deeds of not just the militia members, but the militia leadership. And very famously, Daniel Shea organized a revolution that marched into the courts in Boston and demanded that the courts stop issuing proclamations to collect land and property from good patriots who had defended and won the Revolutionary War. The court said, this is not a problem if you will not pay your taxes or will not sell your deeds to the government. We will send in the militia. The judge, not knowing that the people who he was speaking to was the militia, created a forum for Daniel Shea to stand up and say very famously in open court, "Judge, we are the militia." You can imagine this creates a lot of problems inside state government. Daniel Shea's rebellion, although happening in just Massachusetts, creates a context and a roadmap for many states moving forward out of the years of the Articles of Confederation. An inability of the states to put down revolutions within their own state borders is a major problem if this country is to be governed by law and order and not by chaos. So Daniel Shea's rebellion serves as an important historical example as to why the Articles of Confederation was a failure and why it was not a good constitution insofar as it did not establish the most basic elements of a constitution in prescribing what government can and cannot do and ultimately how it would do it. The Articles of Confederation and its associated failures began to be replicated throughout the rest of the country, throughout the different states, manifesting itself in different ways and creating unique problems within each state. So the failures of the Articles of Confederation was universally recognized as something that, if left alone, would create an environment where the democracy that we had just established and fought during the Revolutionary War to create would spiral out of control and this government would be at an end. The Articles of Confederation and the failures associated with it were not alone in terms of a discussion about what could be done differently to save this democracy. The Articles' failure partnered with a popular philosophy called the doctrine of republicanism, created a context that ultimately resulted in the abandonment of the Articles of Confederation and an establishment of a system of government that embraced the doctrine of republicanism and attempted to compensate for the failures of the Articles. The doctrine of republicanism was not new. It was a philosophy that stemmed from Platonic thought in antiquity. Plato had written a work called The Republic in the 5th century BCE, which had talked about giving governmental power over to representatives of the people. Plato referred to these representatives as philosopher kings and suggested that only philosopher kings could be trusted with governing the people because they had a more advanced understanding of the complexity and implication of law. And the people within the republic should trust their government to govern best if that government's gaining its power and legitimacy through the consent of the governed themselves. The doctrine of republicanism, as represented first by Plato in his work, The Republic, was crafted in a different way, but akin to the Platonic resolution as established in his work thousands of years before the Constitutional Convention in this country. This doctrine, which gets adopted and embraced, is a doctrine that advocates for this Platonic limited government, but with a centralized authority, basing its legitimacy and capacity to govern from popular consent with an objective of preventing tyranny of the majority. There are a couple of concerns embedded within this language of the doctrine of republicanism. First, how do you establish a framework in which you can gain the consent of the governed to govern them? The second, how do you prevent tyranny from the majority if rule is going to be based on popular consent, meaning the majority rules? How do you prevent that majority from ever fully materializing and then utilizing their power as majority to abuse and oppress the minority? These are very important concerns within the establishment of the actual system of government that is a hybrid between this doctrine, this philosophy of republicanism, and the failures of the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, we know these Republican concerns get addressed with the founding solution. The solutions moving forward that we see reflected in the Constitution of the United States are first, that you have government leaders elected by the people, for the people, and ultimately coming from the people. The second is that you must establish a central government with power, capable of accomplishing tasks and providing energy in government's capacity to do work. And in the establishment of a centralized government, you must, three, limit and divide that power within the centralized sphere of government. Giving power to a central authority unfettered, the founders believed was a bad idea. And the limitation and division of power at the centralized level, which we know today as the federal government, is ultimately embedded into the different branches of government in the United States. The fourth solvency to the concerns of this doctrine of republicanism is that not only do you limit and divide the centralized government, but within that framework, you establish what Madison called a multi-tiered, multi-leveled system of government in which all levels check and balance each other, because power is separated within that sphere of power, not just at the central level, but on a national level throughout the different states, and on an individual level throughout the people. This solution, this effort to solve for the problems and concerns within the doctrine of republicanism and the reality of the failures of the Articles of Confederation are convened in May of 1787 at the Constitutional Convention that ultimately produces an environment to create a federal system of government. When the convention is convened, it is convened upon two objectives, two goals, if you will. When the convention ends, their hope is that they will have created a framework of law that is capable of providing energy and stability to each state and the beginning of a sense of nationalism, the creation of a nation, rather than 13 individual states and different people loyal to their states. This first objective is centered around identity politics. The goal here is that people would begin to identify themselves less as Virginians or New Yorkers and more as Americans. The second objective is to establish a centralized government through the centralization of governing power. This is tricky and difficult, considering that under the Articles of Confederation, all power was decentralized to the extreme and left to the states to decide independent of each other. Asking the states to give up that power to a centralized authority is difficult to do today, but especially at a time in which the people who were governing these states had just fought a government who had abused power in Great Britain precisely because power had been centralized into the hands of one man, King George III. So the concerns and skepticism about centralizing power into the hands of one government, even if it were to be represented by all of the different states, were legitimate and well known. So the convention had two very important goals or objectives laid out before itself. Accomplishing these goals would not be easy. The Constitutional Convention, in terms of a context, we know as happening between the months of May and September of 1787. I like to call this the Summer of Secrets because it's during these months, during the summer of 1787, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where 55 delegates, representatives from each of the different states, met in secret to convene and charter a new constitution that would save this democracy from spiraling out of control, solve for the failures of the Articles of Confederation, and realize the objectives and address the concerns of republicanism and an indirect system of government. The debates that would emerge in this Summer of Secrets at the Constitutional Convention were so heated and so well pronounced that a moderator was needed and brought in the name of George Washington. George Washington, a Virginian, was brought in and seen as someone who could transcend the petty differences from the different states that had self-interest in preserving power at a state level. If government power was to be centralized, it was recognized that George Washington could help the different states find common ground and move the convention forward to ultimately being successful in realizing its objectives of creating a stable system of government grounded in a constitution and creating power that is centralized but monitored. This early recognition of George Washington as a man who could transcend this difference and lead the convention forward through moderation is a precursor to his presidency and ultimately to why he became the first president of the United States. There were many debates that grounded the Constitutional Convention and created lots of different concerns as to how this Constitution would be established and how the centralized government would be formed. And ultimately, the center of all of these questions was a concern with power. All politics, it is said, is concerned ultimately and fundamentally with how power is distributed. Under the Articles of Confederation, it was well known that power was distributed at the state level and that very little concern about power was dealt with at a national level, with the objective of the convention being to centralize power. The question was fundamentally, how will each state be represented within the central government? A major concern, if we are to centralize government, how will the states get representation within that government? The second question, another concern with power, is how much power should the central government have exactly? What authority are we going to give to this new centralized government relative to the states? The third question coming out of that, a kind of reaction to the answer perhaps, is how much power should the states have? If the central government is going to have power, but not unlimited power, the leftover power, the limited power, will be preserved for the states. Will it be a 50-50 distribution of power, central and states? Or will the states get whatever the central government doesn't take? Or will it be the reverse? The states will take the power that they want first, and whatever is left over, whatever the states can't decide for themselves, the central government will deal with. These three questions, all concerned with the distribution and management of power within this country, created an intense environment that some historians and political scientists agree created a difficult debate for the convention and ultimately produced perhaps one of the most conceited and document that ultimately we recognize as having been a product of lots of concessions and many different sides reflected within it. Perhaps the most important debate that emerges out of the Constitution happens in the early parts of that convention in the form of a debate around representation within the central government, an attempt to really answer that first question. We know this event as the Connecticut or Great Compromise. The concern with this compromise is an effort to answer that first question. How will each states be represented within this centralized government? Two plans are proposed addressing representation. The first by the delegation from Virginia, the Virginia Plan, which states that representation in the central government should be distributed based on states' population. Virginia uses the phrase representation will be proportional to the state's population, meaning the more populated the state, the more representatives it will have. The less populated the state, the lesser of representation it would receive. This, of course, is presented by the delegation from Virginia, and when Virginia presents this plan, the small states, the least populated states, laugh Virginia out of the room. It's recognized that Virginia proposes this because Virginia is the most populated state at the time, which means that given their plan, proportional representation based on state population, Virginia would get the most amount of representatives in the central government and therefore the most amount of power in the government itself. So you can imagine why Virginia thinks this is a great idea and why some of the other big states rally behind the Virginia plan and promote it as well. Well, the smaller, less populated states propose a plan of their own in the form of the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey delegates put forward a plan to compete with the Virginia plan that says essentially states' populations should be irrelevant if our ultimate goal here is political equality. If we're going to move forward in establishing a government that represents each state equally, the New Jersey delegates argue each state should have the same amount of representatives, regardless of population. New Jersey proposes that each state should have 2 representatives. These 2 plans, the Virginia plan, which promotes representation based on state population, and the New Jersey plan, which promotes an equal share of representation, 2 per state, are mutually exclusive plans, meaning that these 2 plans contradict each other. And debates rally around each of these plans. The big, more populated state organized and behind support of the Virginia plan. The smaller, least populated states organize and support the New Jersey plan. Washington, recognizing the divisiveness of these 2 plans and the divisions that are happening within the convention, asks the delegation from Connecticut to take both plans and come forth with a compromise. What the delegation from Connecticut ultimately produces is a hybrid of both plans. The Connecticut Compromise puts forth a plan that says we can do both. The Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan can happen at the same time if in our representative branch of government, the legislative branch, we have 2 different houses. We not only have a house where representation will be based on states' population, but we have a second chamber, a separate house in one branch of government, whereby representation is equal for every state. When the Connecticut delegates put forth this compromise of the 2 plans, they put forth a plan that ultimately is adopted and creates our legislative branch of government, a bicameral legislative branch of government. A bicameral legislative branch of government is a legislative branch of government, 1 Congress, but with 2 legislative houses. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate in our Congress today. The House of Representatives is a reflection of the Virginia plan. Seats in the House of Representatives are distributed to different states based on their populations. The more populated the state, the more seats that state will get in the House of Representatives. Today, in 2011, the largest, most populated state, hence the state with the most amount of representatives and power in the House of Representatives, is California. We as Californians have more representatives advocating on our behalf in the House of Representatives than any other state in the country today. California in 2011 is the Virginia at the Constitutional Convention, the largest, most populated state with the most amount of representatives in the House of Representatives. The Senate, the second house in our Congress, is a reflection of the New Jersey plan, whereby seats are distributed equally to every state, regardless of their population. Every state has 2 senators. California has 2 senators by the name of Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein. Both senators work to represent California at the federal level in our Congress and more specifically in the Senate. The Connecticut or Great Compromise is an important lesson in the way in which the convention was pushed forward and ultimately resulted in the unanimous signing and agreement of the Constitution of the United States. When the Constitution is unanimously voted in favor of by the delegates at this convention, 55 individuals are saying in a unanimous voice that they agree that the Constitution that they have just laid forth should be the law of the land and should replace the Articles of Confederation. But within this new document that they unanimously agree to, there is a clause which says that if this document is going to be the new Constitution of the United States, it must be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. In other words, these 55 men who meet in secret and produce the new Constitution of the United States recognize that the legitimacy of the government that they're promoting within this document should come from the people. And so, this Constitution, unanimously signed by the delegation in September of 1787, is handed over to the individual states respectively and to the people of this country to vote either in favor of or not. It is the 7th article of the Constitution which establishes the ratification clause necessary for the codification of the Constitution and the creation of our federal system of government. The Constitution of the United States lays down a constitutional framework which promotes a system of government in which significant governmental powers are divided between a centralized authority or central government and states. How that power is divided is the center of some of the most significant debates in the history of this country. We have today a federal system of government because our system of government is a reflection of the power and the way in which it is divided within the Constitution of the United States. For the Constitution to be approved and that federal system of government to be officially the law of the land and the new system for which we will govern our country, there must be, according to Article 7 of the Constitution, ratification, in other words, approval of this document, of 9 states, 3/4 of the states that existed at the time. Article 7 of the Constitution says, must agree to passing this new Constitution and creating this federal system of government. In September, when the Constitution and the federal system of government idea is put out to the people, it doesn't go without debate. Immediately after the convention is ended and the Constitution is handed over to the 13 different states to be ratified or not approved of, the Anti-Federalists, a series of papers published in New York, began to hit the streets. In October of 1787, less than a month after the convention, which produced the Constitution of the United States, is ended, the Anti-Federalists began publishing arguments against ratification. The crux of the argumentation within the Anti-Federalist papers is essentially that if we ratify, if we centralize government and create a federal system of government, power will ultimately be consolidated and concentrated into one centralized authority and then abused, as the Anti-Federalists advocate we saw when King George III and the British Parliament were able to so successfully abuse power because it had been centralized. So the Anti-Federalists are playing off of the emotion and skepticism of a people who saw centralized governmental power as something for which there should be legitimate concern about. The Anti-Federalists ultimately published 85 documents between October of 1787 and the winter months of 1788, all of which advocate for different reasons why ratifying this Constitution, why approving it and creating a federal system of government is a bad idea. Well, even when the Anti-Federalists published these works, mostly with pseudonyms like Brutus, which have an kinship and meaning, metaphorical meaning, to ancient Rome when power had been abused by their central government. These arguments of the Anti-Federalists do not go unchallenged. Figures like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, all of whom had been at that convention and produced and unanimously agreed that the Constitution was a good idea and should be the law of the land, counter the Anti-Federalists with 85 of their own papers called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, are all defenses of the Constitution and all arguments in their collective efforts that argue in favor of ratification. So the stage is set, and for more than a year, that Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are publishing works mostly in New York and some of the other states, arguing against one another, arguing against ratification in terms of the Anti-Federalists, and arguing in favor of ratification in terms of the Federalist Papers. We know that the Federalists and the Federalist Papers, the arguments of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, were convincing enough to ultimately result in 9 states ratifying and approving of centralizing authority, approving of the Constitution of the United States, and thus creating a federal system of government. The breakdown of the first 9 states that ultimately resulted in ratification are as follows. The first state that signed in an agreement of ratification was Delaware in December of 1787. As you can see, moving through these different states, the debate wasn't unanimous. It wasn't unanimously in Pennsylvania supported, where 46 delegates voted in favor of ratification, countered by 23 state delegates in Pennsylvania who voted on their state level to not ratify. Perhaps one of the most interesting and closest votes came on February 6th of 1788 in Massachusetts, where 187 delegates voted in favor of ratification and 168, a very close vote against, voted to not ratify. New Hampshire, the 9th state, has a historical claim to the legacy of ratification because it is New Hampshire on June 21st of 1788 in a 57 to 47 vote that ultimately results in the ratification of the Constitution of the United States and creates, as a result of that new Constitution being approved of as the new law of the land, creating a federal system of government, a system in which power is distributed between a central authority and states, city governments, county governments, and even the people. The question ultimately out of ratification is how that power will be distributed and why that distribution is important. We know that the Bill of Rights are a part of that compromise to those very important questions about the distribution of power. When the Constitution of the United States is ratified finally by the ninth state in New Hampshire, it is now the law of the land. And as such, because of Article 5 of the Constitution, it can be changed. It can be amended. And so James Madison proposes that although Articles 1 through 7 are important in the Constitution, there are limitations in terms of how the Constitution establishes the rights of individuals and the rights of states. It's recognized during the process of ratification, during the debates between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, that the Constitution as it stands when released to the people in September of 1787 is 7 articles. And in those articles, there is very little, if any, mention of the rights of individuals, of people, or the rights of states. Most of the work in Articles 1 through 7 of the Federal Constitution is directed at the central government, the power that it will have, the limitations on that power, how power will be distributed and checked and balanced within the federal government. Very little is directed toward individual rights and states' rights. And so James Madison begins to propose 10 immediate changes, 10 immediate amendments to the federal Constitution after it is ratified, to lay out a framework that will articulate a Bill of Rights for individuals and states, recognizing that the Anti-Federalists' argumentation is valid and important insofar as the Constitution in the first 7 articles does not lay out what Congress cannot touch relative to individual rights and what powers will be reserved for states. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments added to the Constitution on December 15th of 1791, 3 years after ratification of the actual Constitution, prescribe limitations on the power of the federal government and establish individual civil liberties and the reservation of power for states. We will look more in detail at some of these amendments in the third part of Federalism in the Constitution. But what we have in the attachment of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution is a codification and recognition in law that individuals and states have power, and so does the central government. Ultimately, what emerges out of the attachment of the Bill of Rights is an important debate that has really ground a lot of the most important issues in American politics. It is known as the debate of federalism. The debate of federalism is not a debate as to the rightness or wrongness of any one particular issue. It is a debate about the jurisdiction of which level of government should have the power to decide that issue. How the issue is ultimately decided is left up to that level of government. But in this country, because we have a federal system of government, before we can even begin to talk about whether or not something should be legal or illegal, we must first have this debate of federalism, which engages this question of which level should have the power and jurisdiction to decide the legality of any one particular issue. In Article 6 of the Federal Constitution, there is the Supremacy Clause, a piece of the Constitution that reads, "This Constitution and the laws therein shall be the supreme law of the land, and all states and judges are bound thereby." The Supremacy Clause, Article 6 of the Constitution, establishes that if the Constitution or federal law describes or defines the particulars of an issue, its description, its law, the federal law, shall be the supreme law of the land. But what if the federal government doesn't touch the issue? What if the federal government does not address a particular issue that might be important to individuals? That is where the 10th Amendment, the 10th of the first 10 amendments, the 10th of the Bill of Rights, says that all powers not delegated to the Constitution of the United States to the federal government shall be reserved for the states to decide independently of one another. The 10th Amendment is also known as the Reservancy Clause because it establishes a context whereby essentially it says if the federal government doesn't touch this issue, it is reserved for the states to decide. And so in our Constitution, in Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, and the 10th Amendment, the Reservation Clause, we have a debate that emerges as to whether or not any one particular issue should be decided at the state level, reserved for the states to decide independent of one another, or thrown into the sphere of the federal government, thus affirming the power and the supremacy of the centralized authority to decide the issue once and for all, where all states and all judges will be bound to the understanding and authority of the federal government. Classical issues in American politics, major debates have been pitched through this paradigm of federalism. Slavery, a very historically important debate and issue in American politics, was framed through this debate of federalism. Should states individually have the legal authority to have slaves or not? Or should slavery be centralized and amended to the Constitution and made illegal, whereby all states would be bound to that understanding? This debate, this question about slavery, was the framing of debate in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and indeed throughout the country, 10 years before the Civil War even happened. The debates around the morality of slavery, whether or not it was right or wrong to promote slavery, were important. But those debates came after an intense debate of federalism relative to whether or not slavery as an issue should be decided at the state level or at the federal level, whereby all states would be bound to the federal understanding of the legality of slavery. Ultimately, we know, as a result of the 13th Amendment, as a product of the Civil War, slavery is an issue that falls into the supreme law of the land as defined in the 13th Amendment as absolutely illegal, and all states are bound to the supremacy of the 13th Amendment in establishing that slavery for all states in all parts of the country is illegal. Another classical issue that's framed through the paradigm and lens of the debate of federalism is suffrage, the rights of women to vote. Before the 19th Amendment is added to the Constitution, and before women are universally given the right to vote in the entire country, the debate about which level of government should have the power and jurisdiction came first. Should some states be able to make it illegal for women to vote was a debate oftentimes had during the late 19th and early 20th century, long before the Constitution was amended. Or should some states have the power to let women to vote in their local and state governmental elections? Or should this issue of suffrage and universal rights to vote be cast into the sphere of the federal government, thus creating a supreme understanding of this issue of suffrage? Ultimately, we know that suffrage and the rights of women to vote get affirmed in the Constitution, and today all women in all parts of the country have a constitutionally protected right to vote because it is the supreme law of the land. These two issues, slavery and suffrage, are a part of the historical legacy of federalism and a product of a constitution that affirms not just centralized power and authority, but a context for states and individuals to have power and authority to govern themselves. Today, in our world, in the 21st century, we have many issues that confront our political society. issues and debates that many of us have had in some of our contemporary elections and in our discussions with our friends and family, peers and colleagues. Should each state have the power and authority to decide separately from one another the issues of prostitution, marriage, medical marijuana, or even education reform? Or should the federal government have the power and authority to establish a supreme understanding of the legality of prostitution, how marriage should be defined for the whole country, whether or not medical marijuana is legal and authorized if prescribed by the federal government? What about education reform? Today we have No Child Left Behind, which is a federal policy that says to states and local schools the standards of performance that are mandated at the federal level, and all states are bound to it. And if states neglect these performance scores, then the federal government, through state authorities, can put those schools on program improvement and ultimately take those schools over. Is that a good idea? Or should the capacity to govern how our schools work be left up to the states to decide differently, and No Child Left Behind abandoned? What about prostitution? Should some states have the power and authority to legalize it or make it illegal? Or should there be a federal policy that says whether or not once and for all prostitution is legal or illegal? Should some states define marriage different than others? Or should there be a universal definition of marriage defined at the federal level, creating a supreme understanding of marriage whereby all states would be bound to that? What would that definition be? Would the definition mandated by the federal government necessarily dictate whether or not you want the federal government to define this term for us, or whether or not you think that each state should have the power to decide the fate of that issue? Many of these issues are not easy. Many of these issues have a moral thread that for many of us is difficult to separate from our understanding of these issues. Oftentimes we get caught up in debating the rightness or wrongness of prostitution, the rightness or wrongness of any one particular definition of marriage, the rightness or wrongness of medical marijuana, or the rightness or wrongness of education reform. The rightness or wrongness of these issues is not the point of federalism. Federalism is a debate that concerns itself with the jurisdiction of power to decide the rightness or wrongness of the particular issue. It is oftentimes difficult, however, to separate what we perceive as right and wrong from what we think is legal and illegal, and how and at what level of government that issue should be decided. Today's debates in federalism are important to the future of governmental powers in this country. They are important to the future of our politics. And for many of us, these contemporary issues and the debates that surround them are important to us, each of us personally. The fact that we have these debates, the fact that we can talk about these things and ask ourselves at which level of government, the state or the federal, should this issue be decided, is a product of the Constitution of the United States and the framework of law that it prescribes in establishing our federal system of government. I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture on the establishment of our Constitution of the United States and the debates of federalism that have emerged out of it, and a product of our concern with the distribution of power in American politics. Thank you.